All right, so we already focused on kind of the most of the fighting in World War One. We're going to finish up this video series, the home front, as well as kind of the end of the fighting, what kind of happens overall. This is just kind of an outline overview to help you guys put all the pieces together if we can. Let's talk home front. We're going to talk a lot in class about this and really focus on class with social stuff and home front stuff. But the biggest thing is paying for the war and how do you pay for this whole war. This is an American poster, but a lot of countries will go into debt to pay for this. So they use a lot of Liberty loans. Liberty loan was a U.S. kind of phrase, but Britain, France, etc. will also go into debt. The United States was highly, highly, highly invested in World War One. A lot of companies and banks, those kind of things, had actually put their money into the Allies, especially. At the same time, on the other side, every country had to borrow money to either from their own citizens or from other countries to help pay for the war. So think about that in the economic sense after the war is done. Is that if you spend all this money and pay all this money, what are you going to do to pay it back? How's that going to work out? Recruitment. Obviously, every country did conscription to some degree. There's an American poster here as well. But every country had a lot of people volunteer, first of all. This is a time when everyone was kind of skipping off happy to war. People actually wanted to go. They were excited about going to war. And it wasn't until they saw the horrors of that war that they're like, oh, crap, this is not where I want to be right now. People were skipping off, singing songs, thinking, oh my God, it should be so great. And it was almost kind of this disillusion type thing. People were going off to war for heroism, to experience all these great things, kind of live the dream they've been told. And I showed the video, the pictures in the last video. If you want to go back and take a look at those, you can, where people are, skipping off and singing songs, all that kind of stuff. And it's really not that good. I mean, and there's really a lot of issues and problems we have here. And people all of a sudden get to the front lines, they get to the trenches of France. They're like, this is not good. This is not what I signed up for. And that's why you see a lot of people, when they're in the trenches, will, shoot themselves in the foot to get out of action or take sick call, those kind of things, try and not have to fight. Women a lot of times here will take over as munitions workers. So obviously with men leaving for the war and to enlisting or being conscripted into the army, a lot of women took over jobs in the munitions factories in Germany and in France and in Britain and in the United States later on too, which is actually really good for the women's movement. As we talked about women's movement previously, you don't see a lot of the advances of the official, success come until post World War One. And World War One is one of those things where as women take men's jobs, people are like, oh yeah, it's kind of that physical type show that women are equal and can do equal work that men can do. So here's an example of women working in a French factory making, I believe, munitions in this one here, engines, that kind of stuff. Here we have German women at a factory preparing materials for war. Women worked in the fields. This is I believe, either British or U.S. Poster here, but farmers, same thing. Work had to get done. A lot of times, in a lot of countries, women had to step up and take over those jobs to make it work. And so, even on the front lines, women drove ambulances on the front lines, nurses, that kind of stuff, which was originally a man's job. Looking back, even the Crimean War, typically hospital stewards or nurses were men. And I would start seeing, women take over those jobs and do some of those jobs, whether it be typing, some of the very early radio work, ambulance driving, especially. You start seeing women work in the front lines. The American the Red Cross, International Red Cross, being a big part of World War One in terms of providing medical support, nursing for those people that work there. So a lot of women get involved in the front lines as well, which is something that's very, very new for combat. Obviously, we saw the Crimean War, with a very small number of nurses working there. There were much greater numbers of nurses working in World War One. The auxiliary, which is going to be, especially in Britain, the Queen Mary's Army Corps Auxiliary, which was kind of the little quote here, the girl behind the man behind the gun, was a chance to take care of some of those non-combat jobs in the military. So a lot of your driving, your office stuff, those kind of things, for women to join in. And so they did have women play a huge effort in the World War One. It tends to get overlooked a lot, it seems like. World War II seems to overshadow that in a lot of cases, what women did. But these are different things that did actually happen. So it's Army Auxiliary, it's kind of this taking over some of the non-combat jobs that have a military, especially those that are in Britain yet, to help the army run, help military run, while so many guys are on the front lines in France. In Russia, obviously is having its own problems because it's Russia. You actually have female soldiers in World War One. You have women soldiers who take over as 12 million Russian soldiers get killed. women's female soldiers do fight as well in combat, and especially we're going to be behind the front lines. Another thing is with women, a lot of women were involved in the espionage game. As French women, German women were near the front lines. They would meet officers and meet generals and talk to them at parties and balls and all that kind of stuff, and get involved with people that way. And one of the most famous ones was Margarita Giudicelli, who was nicknamed as Mata Hari. She was actually a burlesque dancer, stripper, if you will, okay, who got to know a lot of the upper echelon of of the French and British generals, those kind of things. And here she was actually a spy. And as she would get to know them, she would get to hear different things and they were talking about, and you kind of use position as a woman in society where they aren't supposed to know a lot of stuff, quote unquote, right? And take information back to their home country. And there are women who worked as spies, both on the Allies and the Central Power side, to get information and find information, bring it back to their home countries. We talk a lot about the idea of women, achieving more equality, and a lot of times we show that women are doing a lot of jobs that men were doing, and so it's kind of that proof is in the pudding kind of situation where they can say, yeah, look, listen, we deserve the right to vote, we deserve equality, that kind of stuff, because we did the exact same job. Look at this. Now, the problem is, the war is done in 4 years, 5 years, will last after that. After the war is done, a lot of times the jobs went back to men and things kind of went back to where they were. But it really did push feminist movement because now they had that proof, right? That women did the exact same kind of jobs. They had proved that whole thing, stepped up when they needed to, and took that spot and said, hey, why am I losing my job? All of a sudden guys come back, they get their jobs back. I'm out of a job. That's not fair. Versus, how they can keep their work. So this is where you see eventually a lot of the voting rights bills go through that allow women the right to vote, and that kind of start getting picked up now at the end of World War I. Going on here, let's talk about some other things with the combat kind of end of the war. The British, having a big superior navy, were able to blockade Germany off. So originally, the United States, other countries were sending supplies and money and stuff into both the Allies and Central Powers, whereas the British had a superior navy. They used their surface navy to blockade Germany. So essentially, they didn't allow the ships in. They not only did they use their big surface warships, they also put minefields out to stop U.S. or other ships from going to Germany. So typically, the United States ended up, by the end, only working with the Allies until they eventually joined the Allies' side. The U.S. did trade with both originally. Now, the goal that they had now was how do you starve out the other side? Because obviously Britain is kind of isolated. France is in a mess. And how can you get, this idea of how you starve each other out? Well, Germany, they didn't have the surface navy to blockade Britain. They use submarines, the undersea boat or U-boat, and they use those to sneak up on ships, torpedo them using these new weapons that are available. These are actually pretty dangerous ships to have because they weren't a very well-tested machine yet, and there's a good chance lives could, not survive. But their whole thing was that the U-boats were stealthy. A lot of times U-boats didn't use torpedoes. They used their deck guns, guns on their deck, to hit unarmed transport ship. But you can see just here these two maps. This is 16 to 17, this is 17 to 18, where U-boats sunk ships, whether they be transport ships or warships, off the coast of England and France. And they use that stealth, sneak up on them, jump the ships, and then they basically attacked any ship that had any flag on it they thought was going towards the Allies, and that actually would eventually get them in trouble because that's the United States' official reason for getting involved in the conflict. So here's their U-boat. Like I said, they weren't very big. They were stinky. They were messy. They had 4 torpedo tubes. These torpedoes were the kind of the missile that they could fire. A lot of times they'll use this gun, which is on top here to surface, sneak up on a ship, and use their gun to sink those boats. And obviously we're seeing a new thing here in the idea of total war. That war no longer just affected soldiers. War now was moved off the fields outside of towns and cities into cities, where all that kind of stuff. You start seeing mass conscription where, every, the draft in every country happens where you have all able-bodied men who have to go fight or have to go at least register to fight. If you were not able to go fight, you were seen as a coward. In Britain especially, men who didn't fight were given a I believe the white flower, I believe, and put in their coat pocket. And that was basically told the ladies, don't go out with this guy because he's a coward. He's not fighting. And so, it was even seen as kind of a moral thing from that point of view of you're less of a man if you're not going to go fighting. We see targeting of civilian targets. You see the first ever aerial bombers, or you see the Gotha bomber, it was called, with a big 2-engine plane that dropped bombs on London. You saw the Paris gun we talked about in class that rained shells down on Paris, where civilian targets are being hit now. Zeppelin bombing raids on Paris and London. To scare the local populace, and it was something different. They hadn't really seen that kind of stuff before. Originally, war was always fought between soldiers. Now it's being fought directly in a place. Even going through as Germany went through Belgium, right? That kind of same thing too. The quote unquote rape of Belgium, where they went through that the countryside and supposedly burned churches, all that kind of stuff, is where you see the civilian targets happening. Censorship propaganda is another thing too. We'll look at propaganda here in a second, but we like to nickname the World War I the poster war because they use a lot of propaganda to show just what was happening. I mean, we'll talk about the Irish revolts in 1916, but guess what? Hey, that never happened. That, according to the British, that wasn't in the newspapers. It was going on. People didn't talk about it because the war was happening. So, and they also want to print anything that was not, supporting that country. So even if a battle was lost, they'd print something totally different. If a soldier dies or is shot for cowardice, they'd find ways to hide it. They want to try and make sure to bring country down. That the idea of morale was huge. Try to keep morale up. And try to keep the local populace and the other people fired up against the enemy. That we got more soldiers and more support for the war that way. They didn't try to dehumanize the enemy. And here's some examples of propaganda. Notice the German spiked helmet is how they usually show the German people. And here you have this evil monkey-esque critter type thing. And he's wearing a German helmet, with the blood dripping from his claws, grabbing the country. Here's an American poster with "Destroy this mad brute," having the culture, right? The culture Kampf, right? The idea of taking culture, all that kind of stuff, and the spiked helmet, kind of that sign for the German people. Here we have beat back the Hun Liberty Bonds in our United States poster, I believe. But they likened the Germans to the Huns a lot of times. Huns who came from Central Asia and attacked, Rome. The idea of you have this barbaric people, right? And try to make those links happen there inside people's heads, kind of play a psychological game with them. Here we have a German poster. It's very nice here. Denkt an ihr Kinder, think of your children, with the kind of the British-esque French type thing going on here with them. The little snake is taking away the baby's bottle and vipering him, looks like. So every country tried to make their country look bad, look like it was less human, look some kind of bad reaction to it. Economically, a lot of countries did a lot of difference here. We started really seeing every country eventually go from a free market type economy that we've seen from most of the 19th century go to a more planned economy. Every country did this. Every country had some form of food ration they did in Britain. The United States didn't do as much later on. They're also only in the war for a year. So remember they're the guy that, takes credit for everything. So, they went to this really centrally planned economy where they had price limits, had food limits, rationing, all that kind of stuff. A lot of times unions, you think, wouldn't support this because that involves wages and that kind of stuff being changed. A lot of unions support the war. Big patriotism, you're doing the war effort, getting jobs, all the kind of things. That's how it kind of works that way. In Germany, it was essentially a totalitarian dictatorship under the Kaiser. The Reichstag was not necessarily being consult on anything anymore. Georges Clemenceau, who is basically makes a dictatorship in France to control everything and kind of make it on that war footing and kind of put everything set that way. Obviously, America joins the Allies. We'll do this quick thing, and right now Matt Ryan is shouting "America, America." Okay, whatever. But big thing was Lusitania. So part of the whole issue with the United States was seeing Lusitania, which is a British ship. It was torpedoed by a German U-boat. The argument was that it was carrying munitions. Later on, that's been found to be true, but at the time they didn't know that. Eventually, Zimmermann telegram, where Germany, essentially the German ambassador sends this note to Mexico saying, "Hey, listen, if you attack the United States, maybe we'll get involved." And at this time, there were issues with Pancho Villa and stuff on the Mexican border, so it was a legit concern. and they're using their submarines, that kind of stuff, to make peace. That if Mexico backed Germany, they would make sure they got back the old sections. Now, was this true or not? We have no idea. Notice it says here, telegram received from London. This telegram was sent by the British to the United States, saying they intercepted and decoded it. So there's a lot of questions if it was legality or not. And so you do have them come in here. Eventually, we get a war declaration, eventually after the Lusitania, Lusitania telegram, and the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare, which is the official reason for why. You have General John G. Pershing, who is going to be the kind of the crusader coming across with the United Expeditionary Force. He reduced some Americans in the trenches. Americans did fight a lot, and I'm not taking away anything from the American Army. But most of their time was spent in France getting STDs to some level. You can do that. So Germany does have problems though now. I mean, obviously we've been fighting for a while. They did push very, very close to Paris. They took national holiday and kind of lost momentum. By 1918, you do have U.S. soldiers there. You also have British tanks that can advance a whole 12 kilometers in one day. You start seeing Germany kind of lose steam, right? And people argue that one of the reasons that Germany lost was that U.S. soldiers were coming in. They were reinforcing British and French troops, whereas Germany had no reinforcements, right? They didn't have a chance to have anybody else come in, and they had 6 million casualties, a lot of anti-war sentiment. We'll talk about that in class on Friday, and kind of see how the tone of the war changes a little bit from time to time. And even after Russia left in 1917, Germany here thought it was going to be their chance to win, and so we start seeing things kind of start falling apart slowly. Battle of Argonne Forest here, which is right here next to Verdun, was supposed to be Germany's big push here. Their goal was to push Germany farther out of France. It was a push by both the French and British. And so you saw this 47-day-long battle here, American gunners fighting, and a lot of casualties. Germany eventually has to retreat a little bit. You have the Second Battle of the Marne, Rhine River, same deal here, which was kind of Germany's last big push into France, kind of throw every single thing they had down, but it was stopped and brought and pushed back, and a counterattack by French, British, United States force started pushing the Germans back towards Belgium. At this point, there are so many casualties, and the war is starting to turn the other way that the Kaiser Wilhelm II steps down, leaves power, he abdicates, goes away to Britain, and it's kind of this whole woohoo, the war looks like it's done kind of thing. And eventually, by November 11th, 1918, this is October, we're talking here, okay. This is October. November 9th, he steps down. November 11th, 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month. We've seen armistice sign that ends the war. So we now call this Armistice Day. Big celebration happens as the war is ended, and Germany and its allies end up, actually giving up. But the question we get to that point then is the peace process. And so we have 4 big people get together for the peace process. Woodrow Wilson of the U.S., one of the first presidents to go over Atlantic and go to do this. We have David Lloyd George from Great Britain. We have Georges Clemenceau from France with an awesome mustache. And they kind of bring in Vittorio Orlando from Italy. He kind of just sits there and does nothing, but he's just kind of there, Yay, okay. These guys are trying to figure out what to happen. Now, Wilson brings in 14 points. We'll talk about those in class. Look at those. And their goal is, how do we achieve peace and not have another world war? That's their goal, right? Their goal is to avoid the sequel. Whoops. You know what I mean? And so a lot of things they talk about are free trade and getting rid of national armies and navies, not having more secret treaties. That's point 1 through 5 for Wilson. Essentially, he is trying to make sure that, the main underlying cause we saw, alliances, economic problems, big armies and militarism, all those kind of things don't happen again, right? The other big thing about nationalism is points 6 through 13, and they basically say, look, all the Slavic countries have Pan-Slavism movement. Poland gets their own country. Woo, yeah, Poland. The Czechs, the Slavs, all those different people that are out there should get their own countries. That way we don't have that nationalism movement, right? Allowing people to decide what to do with the government to have. We'll talk about those more in detail on Monday after you guys read the 14 points over the weekend. Last thing I want to say is we should have a General Association of Nations. It becomes League of Nations eventually. That'll solve conflict. So essentially they want to have a mediating body that will keep people in line. And to have that. Now, when they sit down and start talking about this, not all of Wilson's points are taken, and one of the big things that happened is that not everybody's happy with the end of it. When they made the Treaty of Versailles, we'll look at parts of it. Germany, there's about Clause 231 is that Germany must assume all guilt and pay all these war damages. So this is a very highly debated topic about whether or not they should do this. So Germany had to take all the guilt. And we can kind of talk about some class on Friday, but was it really their fault? Yeah, right. So they have to pay all these reparations as well. Also, colonies, as well as some of the national groups in Europe get freedom and get their independence. Colonies don't, and colonies are still out there. And to top it off, France and Britain, the victors, end up taking and dividing up more land for their own colonies. Whoopsies. Okay, Japan, Italy, who did fight on the side of the Allies, didn't get much out of it. Okay, and the United States doesn't even sign it. U.S. refused to sign the treaty because they don't support the League of Nations. They're afraid that they're going to get stuck in this whole thing again. The treaty's not even being signed until the 1920s. By this time, Woodrow Wilson's had a stroke. He is essentially a vegetable until and his wife was running the show anyway. And I love this quote about a treaty built on quicksand. We'll talk about Maynard Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, what he says about it too. But they kind of thought this treaty was – a lot of people questioned this treaty and thought it was going to cause more trouble than it actually did. The war guilt clause is the biggest thing. Here's the text of Article 231, that Germany accepts responsibility for war and it has to say yes. And if you're a German person, it's kind of a big deal. Obviously, you got your tail kicked. That's the one problem, right? And you were hurt. You were eating nothing. You were living through all the rational kind of stuff. And then you got to say it was all your fault on top of it. And so, that's the hard part of a lot of things. It's hard because here you have your big four, you have your little child weeping there in the corner in terms of who's there and the future generations. And, people kind of saw that, there was, some bad things happening here. Germany had to take all the blame. They had to disarm. They couldn't have a military. They had to pay a ton of money back to the Allies and give us colonies as well. And so, we're going to see this set the stage for World War II as Germany was angry and humiliated nation. Essentially, thanks to the peace treaty you set up that's supposed to avoid a sequel, you set up a sequel. We have League of Nations, which is an international organization. It was a league that was set up, a cooperative organization. You could be a member of it to try to prevent future wars. The idea was that if a country did not follow a treaty, that they would try to mediate and step in. The problem was that while it was a great idea, it had no teeth. It had no enforcement powers. Essentially, the league could ask countries to step in and force. So let's say Germany, who had to follow all these rules, we'll look at deeper in class. They couldn't have military or navy, all air force, all that kind of stuff, right? Let's say they did. So they built one. Well, they had to find a country to volunteer and step in and physically disarm them. And if a country didn't want to do it, they could just say no. So this League of Nations has zero enforcement powers. They get asked nicely, "Hi, Germany, could you please not make weapons, that kind of stuff? Please?" But they couldn't actually force anything to happen. Any country could, they had to ask countries to put their troops in play to make that happen. And so it didn't work. It had no power. The U.S. says, "I'm not going to become a member of it." The U.S. goes to an America First policy. They bug out for about 20 years until World War II rocks around pretty quick here. Here's your members of the UN. I could say League of Nations, excuse me. You found members mostly in Europe. You have some here out in different parts of Asia, that kind of stuff. You have colonies that are technically members but aren't members. Some are in the mandate, which is, we'll talk about that in a second. Some are left eventually around the world. The United States never was a member. And so, it's kind of interesting to see where that falls down to. Okay. The mandate system is the last thing I want to talk about here before we get to the artwork of post-war, where essentially the victors of the war take the Ottoman Empire of the Middle East and divide it between themselves, basically making themselves more colonies. So they took things like Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, all that kind of stuff, and essentially divided up for about 25, 30 years until World War II or just before that, where they are control it. So essentially they went and got more colonies out of people's land and just divided stuff up. Iraq's a unique state because of how the Arabs helped fight against the Ottoman Empire. Eventually they were given their independence in 1932, but that's kind of adds a level of conflict because now all of a sudden you have more and more countries getting this mandate system. You start seeing lines being drawn like you saw in Africa and stuff, a lot of future conflicts in the Middle East, especially when we get to Palestine later on. And I'll talk about that post World War II. Ottoman Empire obviously was cut in half. It was now the modern day country of Turkey as their area. Let's talk legacy, okay? Obviously, you have 8.5 million soldiers died, 21 million wounded. you're talking a war that cost $338 billion in their money, let alone our money is. 8.5 million people at this time is loss of a generation. You can kind of see who lost the most people. The Russian Empire by far, over 30% of the military casualties were there from the Entente powers alone. And they had definitely the biggest number of casualties in the conflict, followed by France and Britain. The United States had very, very few casualties, actually. Whereas, looking at military deaths in World War I, Austria-Hungary has, a smaller number than Germany has. Over half of the German deaths for Central Powers were all the German troops. So you can kind of see how many and how many military deaths, total deaths and wounded happen here for those different countries on the Entente side. Whereas Russia has 1.8 million military deaths here, with almost 5 million wounded. The numbers are just outstanding in terms of how many people were wounded, killed, injured as a part of this conflict. Same on the Central Power side. I mean, this was truly a war to end all wars, in that we'd never seen a war of this magnitude before. To top it off, in 1918, you have a flu epidemic that hits, where you have approximately 80 million people worldwide die, and this is spread to the trenches of Europe, and it helps spread through the rest of Europe. And it starts in Spain, we think, and kind of floats through the trenches. Also, really, really bad. Post-war, you have shell shock or PTSD. We talked about this in class a little bit, of the constant shelling, the constant noise, stuff you didn't see in wars before, the effect it has on mental and psyche. You have the reminders of blindness, of disfigurement, loss of limbs, loss of other body parts, all that kind of stuff. In fact, the new era of prosthetics is developed because of this conflict. You see entire cities that are destroyed, need to be rebuilt because of of all the total war that takes place, and how cities are being targeted. As you pre-Belgium, and just see how much the city is just devastated. In some ways, post-war, we have an economic boost and bust. I mean, obviously, Europe needs to be rebuilt, and all the factories and cities and stuff are destroyed. But who's going to do it? The places on the continent, well, they're kind of at a disadvantage because they have to rebuild, whereas Britain has a dominance now because not much of the war happened in Britain. Britain was bombed like a half dozen times. That's it. All of a sudden now, the United States and South America are going to replace Europe as an industrial power because they didn't have any damage to their areas. And so they're going to look to the U.S. and South America, even Britain for that matter, to help rebuild that continent and make those things happen. Real quick, I'm going to show you the art of the war, and we're going to lead to this period called the Age of Anxiety, post-World War I, where you can see the art that happens, the kind of the depression, kind of visual that's showing kind of what happens in the war here. Mixture of impressionists, and later on we'll cut to the more modern art as well, in terms of kind of show what happened. You kind of see the different views of the war through the art that happens. Those who've lost their names, guys who are going through the war, the conflict, gassed and wounded. You kind of see the images of dark, depressing time. And the era post-war war is a dark, depressing time. We can't even imagine what it would be like in Europe at this point. Things that people have seen, they're now showing the artwork that happens later on, and even the idea of how desperate countries were to make things happen. I leave this from J.R.R. Tolkien. He did fight in World War I, who wrote Lord of the Rings. And I love this, the last line where you remember this scene in the movie where they see the pools of water, and it's almost like something that came right from World War I. May faces proud and fair in the weeds in her silver hair, but foul, all rotting, all dead. A fellow like them, I know who they are. Yes, all dead, all rotten. There was a great battle long ago. And so there's a lot of ways that people argue that Lord of the Rings is a allegory of World War I. It's kind of cool because, as I said, Tolkien lived through that. That was long. Thank you for being with me, guys. You're awesome. Thank you all very much.